Traditionally, most people do know us as an accelerator. We've worked with 55 African EdTech companies over the last few years through formal incubation or acceleration programs, but several thousand EdTech innovators across the continent through shorter term initiatives like boot camps and other sort of sprint weeks, that sort of thing. So we definitely have a strong belief that the African population deserves better education, that will drive the continent forward.
Welcome, builders, to How Would You Build It? The podcast that dives deep into the dynamic world of startups and product creation right here in South Africa and Africa. This show is more than just interviews. Every week, we sit down with the brilliant minds to provide a masterclass for building digital products amidst the challenges and opportunities unique to our continent. From seasoned founders to dynamic product managers, we uncover the unique stories and strategies behind some of the most innovative digital products being built. So for all the aspiring founders and product builders out there, you'll discover that each episode is a wealth of practical wisdom and local and actionable insights. Make sure to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to our podcasts and connect with us on social media for even more content. Now, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome, builders, to another episode of How Would You Build It? I'm very excited because we finally got Krista from Injini to join us. Krista, thank you for joining. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm great, Bobby. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, excited for the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. And fresh from holidays and back in the swing of things. Welcome back. How are you doing?
Thanks, Bobby. Great. We're in Q2. Had a good holiday. So yeah, excited to be here.
Yeah. Same here. I've been telling everyone that the long weekend, the long Easter weekend fell perfectly at the end of Q1. So you literally had a chance to reset, take a break, and actually sort of reassess how the year has been going for you. And now go, okay, cool. If 2024 could have versions, we're on version 1.1 now, so we can move on to the next iteration.
You sound like a product manager, Bobby.
Well, as we know, got to get those iterations out. All right, well, let's get going. So, Krista, I think firstly, if you just want to give us a quick roundup of Injini. I know you guys are an incubator for the EdTech industry for Africa as a whole. So really excited because we've also recently had somebody else talk to us about the education space. So yeah, really keen to hear about what you guys are doing and what kind of goals you're looking to achieve.
Great. Yeah, so you are dead on in that Injini is all about EdTech. We have a mission to improve the quality, accessibility, and relevance of education on the continent. So we've always had a Pan-African sort of reach and desired impact. Injini at its core is an EdTech accelerator and think tank. So we support EdTech entrepreneurs and other stakeholders who are trying to make a change in the African education sector by introducing innovation and technology. And we try to create an enabling environment by also dealing with government and research and academia, all of the stakeholders that have a say in the direction of the sector. But traditionally, most people do know us as an accelerator. We've worked with 55 African EdTech companies over the last few years through formal incubation or acceleration programs, but several thousand EdTech innovators across the continent through shorter term initiatives like boot camps and other sort of sprint weeks, that sort of thing. So we definitely have a strong belief that the African population deserves better education. They deserve the quality of education that will drive the continent forward. And we also believe that Africans have the ingenuity and innovation potential to make a real change. So we try to facilitate that as much as we can. So yeah, I've been leading the team at Injini for the last 5 years, but Injini has been around since 2017. So relatively young, but I think we've made a pretty big imprint so far on this sector.
Amazing. I'm still trying to get used to the fact that 5 years is not like 2020, it's like 2017 feels like 5 years ago, not like 7 or 8. It's time's flying.
Right.
But 2017, I mean, EdTech wasn't a thing in 2017. So I mean, Krista, it was really early days of both accelerators and EdTech in South Africa. You guys are like the OGs.
Exactly, yeah. So Injini was the first specialized EdTech, at the time, incubator on the continent. we remain the only specialized EdTech sort of entrepreneurial support program or organization on the continent that I know of. There are obviously quite a few general accelerators and incubators that support EdTech companies as well as lots of other sectors, but yeah, we were a bit ahead of the curve, I'd say. We certainly saw a lot of activity pick up in light of COVID. Speaking of that, that time that compressed our understanding of time and space. So yeah, there's a lot more activity now and a lot more attention being drawn to the sector, but it's I think still relatively early days compared to like the fintechs and the agri-techs of the world.
So Krista, on the COVID thing, like a lot of people have the assumption that it obviously accelerated digital adoption, at least that's my experience in the workplace. But one can make the same assumption for education, right? You can go, well, a lot of people had to go online, but is there, has that continued post-COVID now that people are back going to schools, or people defaulting back to just not using tech and just going back to what was comfortable pre-2020?
I'd say it's a mixed bag. I think there was definitely a recognition that technology has a place in education for the first time. I think decision makers in government and policymakers realize, okay, they actually need to consider ICT in education and what policies around that should look like. I just came from a meeting earlier today about the sort of regulatory environment in education in South Africa, and our ICT policy, well, it's actually just a white paper, expired in 2014 and hadn't been revisited since. So, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that technology is adopted in a systematic way. But, parents and caregivers and teachers certainly got to experience firsthand how much technology made a difference in their children and learners receiving continued access to education over the time when schools were simply not an option. So that recognition is there. There's some continuity in terms of how technology is being used from what we've seen, but there was also quite a dip in terms of the investment of investors and other stakeholders post-COVID. So there was a huge uptick and interest in supporting EdTech and making sure that we were scaling these solutions. And then once we could resume to some sort of normalcy in terms of in-person engagements and going back to schools, a lot of that investment and attention kind of dipped off again. So unfortunately, that makes it quite difficult for innovators to get into the environments that they otherwise, have ambitions to be going into, because they simply just don't have the capital to scale in the way that they need to, particularly because on the continent, the learners that they need to reach most don't have the purchasing power to afford the products directly. So yeah, it's I think that the intention and the interest is still there. The continuity and access is still missing to some degree.
Yeah. You speak about capital, Krista, and how does EdTech compare in terms of how much capital you need? So my assumption is it's can typically be on the higher end of compared to other startups, considering that there's often a hardware component involved. And then secondly, if you're dealing with public schools, you're dealing with governments, and I can imagine the sales cycle dealing with governments is enormous. So how much money do EdTechs need to make it on the African continent?
I mean, it's difficult to say, on average, because there is no such thing as an average EdTech startup. There's so much diversity in terms of the solutions and the range of offerings that are out there. You're right in that government is the obvious customer for most of these solutions, but unfortunately, as you said, sales cycles are long, the procurement process is complicated, because of all of the sort of compliance and like regulatory red tape, essentially. It makes it quite difficult for small innovative companies to get a chance, and much of that red tape is there for a reason. It's meant to protect learners and to avoid corruption, but can backfire in cases where we're trying to make changes rapidly. So yeah, all of that to say that it can be quite expensive to reach the underserved. But even with limitless capital, an EdTech company that is wanting to serve schools across South Africa, for instance, still needs some sort of buy-in from the Department of Basic Education. And no matter how much money you have, that's, that doesn't necessarily answer all of your needs. So yeah, there are certainly companies that have that hardware component, as you mentioned, which might require a bit of upfront capital. But I wouldn't say that's the majority of the companies that we're working with, actually. Mobile is kind of the first avenue for most of these solutions, and our smartphone penetration is actually quite high, despite data costs still being a bit inhibiting. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for you, but
Krista,
funding can be a problem.
You need to take the product management cop out and say it depends. It depends on what you want to build. And that's why we talk about iterations, because we try to get those small iterations first to see the impacts that you can do from a small scale. So that's the product manager's answer to that question.
Yeah, I missed that memo.
It works some of the time, almost all the time. So Krista, I think for me, like one of the big things, there's so many things that we could kind of double down on what's being discussed. And I think, when we talk about getting it to the people, one of the main things that people understand about Africa is the fact that connectivity for people is the problem, right? So getting it to the people, the infrastructure, the internet. I mean, if it's going to be technology that's going to bring solutions to the people, we need to actually be able to get the technology to them via the internet. And if they don't have connectivity, then they're kind of stuck, right? So how are people addressing this problem? Because it must clearly be a very big one when you look at the continent as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely still a big problem. It's changing, it's improving over time. There are quite a lot of initiatives underway to get more people connected. As I said, smartphone penetration rates are actually quite high, not just in South Africa, but across the continent. It's more prevalent than you'd think for even quite a young child to have a phone that's capable of browsing the internet. That's not so unheard of these days, even in quite rural environments. The access to data is of course more of the issue. I think South Africa has one of the higher data cost sort of environments compared to elsewhere in the continent. But yeah, it's also something that's improving to some degree. In the education context, zero rating is obviously quite helpful. So there are a number of education solutions that, particularly over the period of COVID, that were zero rated by government. That was like a mandate that telcos had to comply with. Unfortunately, that lapsed for many of those solutions, but there is a relatively new bill that passed that in the South African context would make it so that all PBOs, the public benefit organizations that have some sort of digital component, should actually be zero rated by the telcos. Because they're tax exempt. So there's quite a complicated conversation that's happening that should see us giving more and more learners access to free zero rated platforms on mobile. Yeah, I mean there's still like Wi-Fi hotspots that exist throughout the country and to other degrees elsewhere in the continent. But I think the easiest or the most practical way around this in the meantime is to create online offline capabilities for education providers. So most of the companies that have successfully worked with quite rural populations or hard to reach communities are doing that pretty effectively. Most people get access to connectivity at least like maybe a couple times a month. So if they're able to work through content offline through a mobile device, assuming they also have access to electricity and can charge that device, they're able to then sync up at a Wi-Fi hotspot when they go into town on those occasions where they get to do that. And have access to new content or to see the assessments come through when you're talking about education solutions. So those solutions exist and are effective to a reasonable degree. Obviously, we'd be winning if more people were connected, but I think that's quite a long journey, and something that is very dependent on a lot of players that we in the sort of startup ecosystem don't necessarily have a lot of control over.
So Krista, I mean, the term EdTech is quite broad, right? I mean, we're talking ECD straight through to, university level, older people. Where do you think EdTech has the biggest role to play, or where have you seen, which area have you seen the most success in, and why?
So, I mean, this might come down to a personal sort of preference, but I feel that EdTech has the biggest role to play in supporting teachers or supporting educators more broadly. I don't necessarily think, particularly in early childhood phases, that we need to be plopping a tablet in front of every 6-year-old and saying, like, figure it out, use this tool to learn.
Please no.
Right. So, but technology does have quite a big role to play in supporting the educator that is supporting that 6-year-old. So where at all possible, training and supporting teachers, or lessening the administrative burden that's sitting on teachers, so they can free up their own time to spend more time with the child in one-on-one engagements. Like, all of that is exactly where technology is positioned to support education the most, in my opinion. Similarly, in helping to identify competency gaps and backlog in a learner's understanding of a particular topic, there are several companies, and the one that always comes to mind in our South African context is Reflective Learning, that's doing this really effectively. So supporting the teacher to better understand where their learners are and suggesting personalized learning paths for that learner to make sure that they're catching up on the content that they should have learned several years before, but didn't, because unfortunately the education system is a bit broken. So if technology can help to identify what those areas are that need to be focused on and develop plans for an overburdened, overstretched, underpaid teacher, like, yes, let's do that. So as a tool to complement and supplement teachers is where I see EdTech being the most useful and effective and impactful, really.
And I love that, because that's not replacing teachers. It's really just scaling them and empowering them to be better at what they're doing already.
Exactly. And yeah, I think that's that shift in mindset has happened, or has been happening, I think. Particularly younger educators, I think, are aware of the benefit that technology can bring. And in fact, there's a study in the Western Cape maybe a year or two ago that tried to get a feel for what educators actually think about technology. And in fact, most of them are quite excited about adopting it. Like, we have this assumption that teachers are anti-technology, or they're super old school, but that is actually just an assumption in many cases. And once given the opportunity and exposure and understanding that this can empower them, they're quite keen to get on board and get the training they need to use it effectively.
Yeah, because in our last episode, we had Gabby from Mindjoy, and she was telling us about the extreme shortage of teachers. I mean, it's quite a known fact, actually. So, maybe technology can, that famous word in startups, which is retention, to retain some of the teachers in the system, because like I mentioned in the previous episode, there's just such a hole in the bucket for teachers that get wind down and just overworked and undervalued, and they go off the grid. And it's the kids, it's the people that need them the most that are suffering. So if technology can help bring them back, or keep them at least, that's a huge thing. Because I'd love to know what kind of solutions are out there, right? So you, as an incubator, as an accelerator, I'm sure you're privy to some solutions out there. Are you able to share any of those?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you spoke to Gabby. I mean, Mindjoy is great, and we're hoping to be working with them more formally very soon. But yeah, I mean, we've worked with, as I said, quite a few EdTech companies. Many of them are working in that teacher training and support space, but we also have a few that are, for instance, quite focused on supporting early childhood development centers, creches, informal or formal creches. I think there's a lot of potential to support those ECD owners who often are just, community members. Almost like people think of them as glorified babysitters in these communities because they're just a place to drop your young kids, but they don't have the training to provide quality education or to ensure that all of your, cognitive milestones are being set. They're just good community members trying to look out for their communities. So there's a lot of opportunity to support those types of individuals who are really stepping up to help them create a sustainable small business while also supporting those children in the way that they need supported. We know the importance of early childhood development and of interventions at that very early stage. The first 5 years are so important to a child's development, and yet up till today, there's still many children who have no exposure to the formal education system until grade 1. So yeah, there are quite a few companies that are playing in that space, whether they're supporting the caregiver or the creche owner directly, or perhaps designing formative assessment tools to help that same creche owner to understand where the child is from a development perspective, and to help give that data to the parents and tell them, like, listen, something's awry here. You might want to consider these options. Like those sorts of things are super important. So there's an organization called Trackosaurus that is working in that formative assessment space really effectively with game-based tools that the child just thinks is a really fun game, and meanwhile it's actually checking for specific milestones and helping to understand whether there's the right level of spatial awareness set for that child, or even like motor, gross motor skills. Like those sorts of things are being tested, which is quite cool. Grow ECD is a company that is specifically working on the ECD management side, as I mentioned earlier on, like helping to formalize informal creches and support those business owners to become a bit more sustainable. There's a model there's an organization called PlaySense that we've supported in the past that's also playing in this ECD space, but focused on creating micro schools in communities where a parent who might be staying at home is just super passionate about education and can host a small school, like a play school at their home, given all the equipment and resources to do so effectively. So yeah, some really interesting models in that space. There are also quite a few that are using sort of innovative delivery models, like WhatsApp, for instance. There's a company called Digify Africa that is supporting predominantly youth across the continent to access things like digital skills and even just like basic digital literacy and safety when using the internet. These sorts of things aren't necessarily taught in the formal education system. So using like chatbots and things to do that in a really scalable way has been effective. Plenty more. There's so many. Yeah.
But that's great. That's great to hear. And Rania, I just can't help it. I don't know if it's Wigwag that did this to me, but I know that there's other products out there, but the movement towards WhatsApp, and I think because of its penetration, it makes sense that EdTech gets in there too, right? And uses it because of that reach that it has. I mean, I don't know like what that tool would look like if it's a chatbot that kind of just prompts them, because there's this hybrid approach to education, I would believe, with technology, right? Because you don't want to take them out of the classroom, or you don't want them moving away from actually interacting with other kids and being in a learning environment like that. So it's like, how do you kind of give them a bit of both, right? So when you go home, here's a couple of prompts when you get home that you can go and do whatever. I mean, I'm just spitballing here, but it sounds like there's those kind of opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. I think like just meeting people where they already are, people have WhatsApp, they're not going to delete it from their phone. So why not use it for educational purposes as well?
So, Krista, something that I'm wondering about, right? And by the way, it's one of the reasons why we started the newsletter, is like you mentioned all these amazing companies, and looking at their websites and the stuff they're doing, I'm like, why does no one, well, at least why do I not know about these companies? Like, there's so many awesome people doing great stuff in this space. And it's as if mainstream media hasn't really picked up on what's happening here. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on media of today, but I think one of the main reasons is that we just tend to focus on the negative stories rather than the good news stories. And there are a lot of really tragic and upsetting statistics that are plaguing the education sector, and they get a lot of headlines. And yeah, there aren't a whole lot of headlines that are speaking about the entrepreneurs and innovators who are trying to address those big challenges. So yeah, we have a number of partnerships with various kind of news sites, and we're trying to get more exposure for these companies and hopefully get them partnerships that will change that narrative a bit. But I think it's just kind of the way humans are, right? like focusing on the negatives.
We'll help, Krista. I'll make some of these guys famous. I think the stuff they're doing is awesome.
Great.
It's really great. It's really creative.
Well, that's what we're trying to do, Renier. So I'm glad that we can plug those holes. But Krista, a word that you used that I love, which is statistics. And I saw somewhere else, I can't remember where it is, that you are quite passionate about evidence-based decisions and making sure that you have some form of evidence. And as a product manager, that's what we drive off. We want to know why, give us the reasons that we need to go ahead and build this or whatever it is. So can you just tell us why that approach is so important and why you feel so passionate about it?
Yeah, I think if we rewind all the way to sort of the beginning of Injini, there really wasn't a lot of research at all in terms of what kind of innovation or technology works, especially in the African context. There's still not all that much. Most of the research is sitting in the global north, which ultimately helped to, or sort of triggered us to conceptualize and build the Injini think tank, which is our sort of research and advisory arm, and really aims to build or to share insights from our positioning in the ecosystem and to run research as to what's actually working in African EdTech. So yeah, I mean, I think to directly answer your question, when it comes to education, there are so many myths in terms of like how people learn. To name a few, like, have you ever heard of the learning styles theory? If I were to ask you if you're more of a visual learner or
you have to run around while you study, right? No one.
So yeah, so a lot of people think like, oh, I'm a visual learner, I need to see a graph in order to understand something. Learning styles actually don't exist. It's not a real thing. It's a total myth. And yet there are, just in South Africa, there are dozens of EdTech products that I've seen that are designed around the idea of learning styles, where they're trying to appeal to people because if you're a visual learner, then I'm going to show you a video, or if you're an auditory learner, I'm going to play an ebook for you. These aren't actually real things. So there's a reason that cognitive science as a field exists. We do have a pretty good understanding as to how people learn, and so education products should be built on those foundations. So in the education context, like it's super important that evidence is driving the way that we're designing products. It's like we know quite a bit about like interleaved practicing and chunking and the spacing effect and dual coding. Like there are these practices that are known and that can be implemented into technology products quite easily as long as people know about them. But then there's also the need for them to explain to their users, like, this is why this thing is working, or it's quite a big ask. But really, we're just concerned about achieving the best learning outcomes possible with the limited time and resources people have. So let's not spend time using products that don't actually work because they depend on
are you able to share some methodologies that you do to gather that kind of evidence, so for other people to also, because that's super important, right? How do you gather that data?
So yeah, I mean, we do quite a bit of market research as Injini to support decision making within the startups that we work with. That's not necessarily speaking to the cognitive science piece, which is, again, like this information is super well known. We have a partnership with Carnegie Mellon University, and we've worked with the EdTech Hub, which is sort of a very research-based global organization. And we've run courses on evidence for EdTech entrepreneurs. So like there are a lot of things that we do to try and get this information to entrepreneurs and make sure that they're incorporating evidence in their decision making and their strategies. In terms of like actual methodologies or examples, I think it's really just about doing a bit of research on your own first. Trying not to rely on the common myths. If you think like, okay, not to keep going back to the learning styles thing, but just not taking things for granted in terms of like what you expect to be the case when it comes to education. So many people assume that they're experts in education because they went to school. That's kind of like the starting point that many people come from. Like, I think they know everything there is to know about primary school because they went to primary school, and it's actually like you can't blame people. It makes sure like your experience is valid, but I think just really emphasizing the need to deal with education specialists, or to at least have a bit of spend a bit of time doing a bit more research is super important in this space.
Yeah, exactly. And I assume, I mean, as an incubator or an accelerator, you're getting different kinds of founders that are coming to you. So like, I'd love to know the kind of lessons that you can see, that you give those first-time founders and the guidance that you're giving to the second-time founders, because I think there's also a gap in that layer of actually parting knowledge with people that have got some, skin in the game already, that have learned the lessons, that have their school fees as such. So I'm just trying to understand how you part those kind of lessons on so that you don't have to redo it every time with every cohort that comes through Injini.
Yeah, I think it's, so again, like focusing in on education as our specialization, there are things that like really need to be in place from the onset to measure efficacy. So one of the first things that we do with any company that we're engaging with is really unpack their theory of change and understand like, okay, what kind of impact are you trying to achieve here? Many companies haven't even heard of a theory of change. Like, that's super common for a founder to just have no idea what we're talking about. They're like, I have a business model. Is that what you're interested in? And like, no, when it comes to education, really understanding what kind of impact you're trying to make is key. So yeah, that's an early conversation that has to happen. And from there, we can start mapping indicators. So like, what kind of data is going to be tracked over the course of a learner's time on your platform, so that we can say whether or not it's working and you are sort of moving towards that ultimate impact. So it's going to be different with every company, of course, because every company's theory of change is going to be different. But I think like that's kind of a non-negotiable to our approach. Like, understanding how important impact M&E is key, and something that, I mean, we will repeat as many times as we need to, because that's the whole point of doing what you're doing. You don't really get into education to make money. if you did, then like something went wrong. But yeah, you get into education because you care about education, and you believe that it's the foundation to society. So we try to make sure that that's always at the core, and that mission is driving the way that you're building your products. So yeah, I don't know if that's directly answering your question, but like, understanding that theory of change, mapping indicators to that theory of change, and then reminding companies that like the only way that they grow is by proving that their product works and does what it says it's doing is is kind of a cornerstone to how we work.
Such a basic principle that many startups get wrong. They don't do that. Or even like corporates that are building new features, they do the same thing. So yeah, it's everywhere. Sorry, Renier.
No, so Krista, I mean, Injini is got a great reputation in EdTech space, and I think we need way more accelerators, of the same quality, in other sectors. So if you were to tomorrow start a brand new accelerator, and let's keep it industry agnostic, how would you go about it? And then I think very importantly, like what is a business model that can work for an accelerator based on your experience working in one?
So if I were to start a new accelerator tomorrow, sure. It's tough. I guess, yeah, I would start with understanding the demand. I think, if we're talking industry agnostic, obviously there might be several partners that have a demand for new initiatives. In our context, it's super important that we understand government priorities, because government is the key stakeholder when it comes to education, and at least in the South African context, most of the continent. But if you're talking about, agri-tech, obviously you have other key decision makers and large stakeholders. So understanding what kind of problems they're trying to solve for, I think, is the first step to building an accelerator that is actually playing a role in the ecosystem and proving to be additive and not just, another accelerator. That's not what the ecosystem needs. So yeah, really starting with like a solid thesis and firm understanding as to like what type of problems they want to solve, I think would be the first step. And then when it comes to business model, I mean, for us, because we're focused on education, we have positioned ourselves as a nonprofit organization. We're nearly fully philanthropically funded. So we have amazing partners like the MasterCard Foundation. We've worked with funders like the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the UBS Optimus Foundation. So large international philanthropies that have a key interest in improving education on the continent. So we look for partners who are aligned with our mission, but also see the sort of need to approach it a bit differently. Obviously, there are quite a few kind of grant providers that would prefer to stay a bit closer to the direct impact. And when I say that, I mean like directly supporting the entrepreneur, for instance, who has that direct link with the learner. So it does take quite a special partner to understand the role of an accelerator in the ecosystem and why that's necessary. Business models for accelerators outside of education, I think, have a lot more flexibility in terms of what types of partners and sponsorship they look for. There are plenty of successful corporate sponsored accelerators on the continent, and that model can certainly work where there is a demand from those corporates for particular problems to be solved. So where that's the case, then like, sure, that's a much more sustainable way to go about sort of solving for that problem. But yeah, I think it's a problem that the sustainability question for acceleration is quite, it's prevalent across the globe. We're not just struggling with this in Africa. It's you see it in the US. It's quite an issue no matter where you look. Of course, there's like the equity and investment model that many accelerators employ. We tried that in the early days and just found it to be a bit distracting from our mission. So trying to make very small investments into very risky startups that were extremely impact oriented just felt like a bit of a disconnect to what we were trying to achieve. So all of our financial support ever since has been in the form of grants that we provide directly to the companies we support. So I think depending on the sectors that you're working within, a different model is going to make sense. But for us, philanthropy has made the most sense, while we also kind of supplement our income with consulting and research advisory services. So that's worked so far for us.
Awesome. That's a really good answer. And I think anybody building, if they paid attention, I think they can find some tips of how to get going.
Great.
So Krista, we're going to start wrapping up. But can you tell us of any cool initiatives that Injini is undergoing at the moment, and maybe where people can find you if they want to get involved?
Sure. Yeah, so we are just about to sort of announce our second cohort. I think by the time this podcast comes out, we would have publicly announced the second cohort for the MasterCard Foundation EdTech Fellowship Program, which is a really amazing venture support initiative that is focused on South Africa. So despite our Pan-African focus, this particular program is South African focused. We will be working with 12 new inspiring EdTech companies that already have quite a bit of traction. So please do plug those in an upcoming newsletter because they're all doing really amazing work and can use the exposure wherever they can get it. So that's something to look out for. We have our annual South African EdTech Week that we host every year, close to the end of the year. So please follow Injini on wherever you browse your social networks. You can find us at Injini Africa on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on soon to be Instagram, Facebook, and our website's injini.africa. So you can follow along and make sure that you attend our South African EdTech Week later this year.
Amazing. Renee, any last questions before I put Krista through our lightning round?
No, this was awesome. Thanks, Krista, and good luck with the lightning round.
Thanks.
As if it's going to be this hard thing to do. So, Krista, just a few questions as a playful way to finish the episode. Just fly the first thing that comes to your mind. Let's see how many we can get through in like 2 minutes. 120 seconds. Let's see how many questions we go through. All right, ready? First one. What book would you recommend and why for a founder to read?
Sure. I love Shoe Dog. It's like my favorite startup related book that I've ever read. Yeah, it's a good one. It's just like such an inspiring story. I mean, he created one of the biggest brands of all time, and it's like quite a nice narrative. Yeah, so it's a fun one.
Yeah, it is a good one. I enjoyed it as well. So as I guess a mentor, what kind of advice do you normally give your founders when they walk through the door?
Focus, I'd say. So figure out what you're trying to do and do it really well. Don't get distracted by all of the opportunities. Really just focus.
Nice. We've had that one before as well. So I agree, because you can get distracted in this day and age. What habit do you feel is a good that helps breed success for a founder? What habits should they be trying to take on?
Pay attention to the customer, or in our case, the learner. I think it seems quite obvious, but I think we often forget to listen to feedback and to really engage with that feedback with a curious mind. So don't get defensive or feel like you're shutting down or you may as well give up. Like, listen to what your customers and learners are saying.
Cool. I love it. Again, as a product manager, amazing. Talking to my heart here. And then what role is AI going to play in education? You've got 20 seconds.
Sure. a really big one.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, it has the potential to be transformative. I think it also has the potential to be a huge disruption, and like there are potential harms that AI presents to learners and people generally. But if embraced in a smart way, like it can really change the game for educators, particularly. Making their lives a lot easier and supporting learning journeys to be much more personalized and targeted.
Brilliant. And then the last one, if you could sit across the table, at a table of one mentor or someone you've appreciated that's helped you, who would it be? Who would you like to have dinner with, dead or alive?
Sure. That's a really tough question. Wow. Sure. I want to say maybe Melinda Gates. I'd be keen to have a chat with her. Yeah, let me go with that for now.
Nice.
She watches the podcast diligently, so I'm sure she'll reach out after this.
She'll be
Great.
ringing you up any day now.
Yeah, send her my number.
Cool. Oh, well, thank you very much, Krista. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I really do look forward to watching Injini and what you guys bring out, and look forward to collaborating again in the future. Thanks for joining today.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Pleasure.
Thanks, Krista. This was really informative and helpful, and I'll stick to that promise of helping making the startups famous.
Thank you. Looking forward to seeing that happen.
One newsletter
Thanks,
at a
guys.
time. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
Thanks,
You
Krista.
too. Bye.